Hello, this is Dr. J, and I am going to just give you a summary of the week's material this week for week 8. So, if we go here to week 9, we're going to do the summary of week 9. Got a whole lot of different type of material that you can read and engage with. We also have the first essay. I believe you don't necessarily need a new lecture on any specific topic given all of these unique materials. So this week, you're going to want to finish the book, and you're also going to want to review all of these materials. So Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down should be done by the end of this week before you begin the final essay, or excuse me, the second essay, final essay process when you begin doing sort of all of these essays. We have this article here, which I'm going to get to here in just a second. And then I had a very excellent conversation with Pachia Yang, who is my friend, who is married to one of my childhood friends, and I interviewed her last week. You should be very familiar with this. She is, of course, really excited to talk about this. Not many people, even in her hometown of Milwaukee, know all of the various different struggles that Hmong people have had to go through in order to assimilate into the United States. And I would say, just from my experience, that first generation of individuals who arrived from Laos and Thailand in the 1980s, for the most part, they have not fully assimilated. There are many linguistic issues and cultural issues that haven't necessarily been resolved for those immigrants, those people who immigrated for the first time. However, their children, so people like Pachia Yang, are almost completely assimilated, besides this pride or extra knowledge they have of their family's history, which I think is just a rather normal thing in the United States, to have this sort of immigrant identity and to be able to embrace it, particularly if you are in that generation. So some really interesting videos. So we got a video that she shared. I watched it. It's about the Secret War. It's a little bit older of a documentary, but let's click on it
If
here.
you
We
have a
can sort of
seven,
see here it's got some ads going on. Let's get this going. Can talk tax time. So we got some good tax ads here. Always good to get some commercialism in the lecture. So you can see this is just a little bit older of a documentary. I think it holds up really well, for the era it is, and it captures pretty much what it was like in the 1980s in Laos for many Hmong people. And there's just some interesting, very interesting uh, callbacks to what we see in the book, Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down, some of the conditions that were very prevalent. So check that video out. It's a good one. It's one you can most likely just watch and peruse. It's not going to be required, but it'll be recommended. So as you are preparing for your essay and you're like, oh, I want to get some extra material, I want to get some extra context for how I can write about this, excellent resource. So also I have shared some of these messages. We have Birdsong, another video that gets shared here. If we go here, it's a BBC video. And then we also have another video about child soldiers. And you can just sort of see organically. Particularly, I want you to think about the interview process. And these are just some ways that we have followed up on the interview after the fact. I think it's really important to leave the conversation open after the fact. The person who is interviewed often has these other ideas that they recall far after the fact, and it's just really interesting to continue the conversation and develop that. So here we have one from the early 2000s, which is pretty interesting. I actually looked up part 3, and I thought it was somewhat exploitative of the individuals. You can look this up. It sort of makes it seem like, so you have part 3 here, which is sort of like Hmong in the U.S., and then you have part part two here, which is sort of like the earlier part of the Al Jazeera video. And it's like almost like there's this white savior complex and dynamic to the video. And I shared it with Pachi, and she was like, "Oh wow, yeah, this is very different." Then we also, I sort of mentioned it has this sort of Gran Torino vibe, and then we got into a conversation about telephone calls, just random telephone calls. And then we have here, very last, is a Facebook reel where it's a different Hmong woman that Pachia follows that had an explanation about how the spirit works. And it's just in a little bit different format. It's like a 1 minute video. I think if you're curious, like you're still not really fully understanding what the spirit is like, and spirit catches you and you fall down. And I think that's definitely a possibility because it's such an abstract concept and it's sort of grafted onto the US understanding of the world. We see that there is this other way that we can explain it. And as you're trying to explain it, maybe you can sort of find some inspiration in turning these ideas into your own words. From there, I put together a bunch of audio messages. I hope this works out really well. This is the first time I've done this, but I actually, wait, I didn't download the audio messages. I just played the audio messages and I screen recorded it, and it showed up. And it looks like it's okay, but listen to them. You can sort of get some extra context. There's some really interesting stories about medicine in Hmong culture. Pachi is talking about what happened when she was sick and the types of treatment that her grandparents and parents would give to her. And then you have a very new story, and I don't have the conversation that I had with Pachi about this, but we've been talking about this in my circle of friends, the same circle of friends as well, because this is a woman from our city who, I guess, more or less, she was found guilty of helping to count money in a marijuana sting. If you're from a place like Colorado or Illinois, the idea that there's this whole illicit economy around marijuana has sort of gone away. Marijuana has been very much legitimized, but in Wisconsin, there is no legal marijuana. We are a bunch of heavy drinkers, and the Tavern League, the largest organized group, private interest group in Wisconsin, has this huge political ear, and in order to encourage drinking, they have tried to abolish and continue to abolish the sale of marijuana. So, as the result of this, since this woman lived in Milwaukee and not Chicago, she was found guilty of helping to count money for marijuana, got some bad advice from a lawyer, and went to jail for 2 years. And the lawyer said, "Oh, your green card's not going to be affected." Well, the moment that she got out, she got deported to Laos and went straight back to the types of settings that you see in those videos that Pachia shared. These Laotian settings where there's just sort of detainment. It's a authoritarian communistic regime. The Hmong are considered political dissident groups, and this woman was completely cut off from the social network that she had established since moving to the United States when she was, I believe, 8 months old. Here, after that, I have this week 9 discussion. I would recommend doing this week 9 discussion before you start preparing for the essay. If you look, this is more or less fill in the blank the qualities and the criteria that I want in the essay. I've been receiving an increasing amount of AI pushed out essays in the last previous year or two, and this really is an AI-proof structure. If you do this well, if you have a citation in response to each and every one of these questions, if you have a personal anecdote that relates directly to the group you are talking about or the subject you are talking about, so not just talking broadly about immigration. If I see a broad statement about immigration, I'm going to assume that it's not your own idea, just because it's not grounded in this very specific context of, and for at least this essay, comparing Hmong immigrant experiences to a immigrant experience that you personally have witnessed or experienced. So this is going to be a nice planning document. And if you look, this discussion, so week one, what's the central story you're telling? So are you comparing Hmong experiences to Rohingya experiences in the United States, another refugee group that lives on the same street and in the same neighborhood as mine in Milwaukee? I have many Rohingya neighbors from South Asia. So we have Southeast Asia, South Asian, very different experiences. How can we compare them? That is the story I am telling. You're going to want to return back to that story. Every single paragraph that follows, you want to remind me, the reader, why you're talking about all this stuff. And if you look at what AI puts out, AI can't really address this type of intermeshing of information and styles. What's the central argument? I would like you to define the thesis really well. This is something, the most challenging aspect of the essay I find for many people. What are you arguing? What is the theoretical and social position that you are taking? What big ideas does this argument engage with? What are the key terms? What is another story from the course that compares to the story of your paper? This applies to every paper that I assign, this sort of sub-question, but particularly for the paper that you're going to be doing this week, focus on Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down. This is the other story you're comparing it to. I sort of spell that out for you right in the essay prompt. And then what is your firsthand experience in relationship to the story? What have you witnessed? What's the ethnographic material you can contribute? And how would you embed yourself in this story? What is the ways that you could expand and develop, maybe talk about an interview that you could give, or a consequence of going down this academic rabbit hole and trying to understand things? And here I have the essay question. I think it sort of speaks for itself. I will let you review it. Please email me if you have any questions. So looking at this, we have two essays that I didn't get to last week, two journal articles that really are going to help you articulate some of these broader ideas. Let's see if we can zoom in a little bit on here. So the one from last week, Migrant Integration Policies, Perceived Group Threat and Generalized Trust, a case of European countries. We've sort of seen a lot of these different ideas before. So what you really want to do when you get these broader explanations of a general field of study, they're great and they're useful for just sort of finding that idea that you want to latch onto in your specific case study. So as you're reading this now and reviewing this, it's going to give you a bunch of different ideas that inspired this generalized survey. And there's something like 30,000 participants in the survey, so it's a huge survey. And what is the underlying question about this this general topic, right? So just reading the abstract, the large inflow of migrants into Europe in recent years has triggered more frequent discussions on how useful a pro-integrative migration policy is for society. I paused there. Pro-integrative migration policy, great key term that we can link on to as we're reading this. What are the pro-integration migration policies that we see in other parts of the world, and how do they work? How much are they trusted? How effective are they? There have been many studies considering various aspects of migrant integration policy, but its impact on social capital, particularly on an aspect as crucial as generalized trust, still requires further investigation. In our study, we use the Migrant Integration Policy Index, MIPEX. You're going to see MIPEX throughout this essay, and data on generalized trust in the mainstream population's perceptions of group threat from migrants using the European Social Survey, the ESS database, to explore the relationship between generalized trust and both the total MIPEX and its components. Okay, so this is our real long two sentences. We're looking at all these different indices, all these different perceptions of immigrant groups and how they compare across two different styles of indexes. Very important for policymakers, very important to get that overarching idea. Our database includes 22 European countries, 39,079 respondents. We hypothesized that a pro integrative migration policy would be connected with generalized trust indirectly via reduced perceived group threat from migrants. So we get these migrants on the same cultural level as the rest of society, and we are going to get less suspicion, less threat perception from that broader society, which now sees a partner rather than an interloper. Okay. However, the effects of 8 individual MIPEX components were discovered to be different. So every time we change these different indices, we're going to see a different result. It's not necessarily we always raise and we always raise trust, or we always raise integration and we always raise trust in the same exact way. We discuss limitations related to the generalizability of our results, given that patterns may be different in North America, where cultural distance between majority and most migrant groups is typically higher. We segregate migrants in the United States much more than we do in some European countries. We thus suggest that future research on generalized trust examine variables related to values and cultural distance and proximity between the main street and migrant groups. And I think these are some good culture key terms, right? Multiculturalism, ethnic diversity, migrant integration policy, perceived group threat, generalized trust, and then going back here, pro-integrative migration policies. All really good key terms that you can go and look at as we're developing our papers. You can look at the broader history of immigration, more or less looking when Europe became immigrant countries during the Cold War, and at the end of the Cold War, we see that there is this balance between restrictive, permissive, and integrative strategies. Following this, we see a social cohesion and generalized trust theoretical discussion. So if you really want to latch on to that pro-integrative migration policy, you're going to get a really good explanation of all the different theoretical and academic backgrounds of that term. Moving on from there, we see the explanation of the Migrant Integration Policy Index. This is more or less a theoretical and a methodological study. How do we get our data? How do we interpret our data? What use is this data? Migrant integration policy, perceived group threat, and trust in society. We can see furthermore some theoretical discussions. So these are going to be all overarching conversations about trust and threat in society as it relates to these different discussions. We have some hypothesis then as we're looking at this very specific comparison in the migration integration indexes. Number one, a pro-integrative migration policy in a society is positively associated with generalized trust. You get more integration, you get more trust to that immigrant group. A pro-integrative migration policy has a negative relationship with a perceived threat from migrants. You get some better trust, less threat from migrants. So the first one's about positive generalized trust. The second one is much more associated with threats. So what are the positive feelings? What are the negative feelings? A pro-integrative migration policy has an indirect relationship with generalized trust through reduced perceived threat, which acts as a mediator for this relationship. So there is a cohesive intersection of these two qualities that interrelate to one another. So sometimes it goes up, sometimes it goes down, and then we can see that the two indices are reacting to one another. Data and methods, collecting and comparing these methods. Many of you might not be too interested in this. This is just definitely something that has to do with like a lot of spreadsheets and stuff. I would definitely encourage you to just at very least look at how it's constructed and understand exactly what's being discussed, even if you don't fully understand it or if you don't think you can jump off the diving board and into the pool of the stats itself, you can at least sort of get the vibe of where things are going. So you have this generalized trust and perceived threat survey, 1 to 10 or 0 to 10. And then you have that correlated over the course of 39,000 participants in 22 countries. And then you set a certain set of variables that are going to be micro level variables such as age, education, and household size. That's probably going to affect how we view specific immigration groups. Often, if your group is competing against an incoming immigrant group, there is going to be a level of suspicion. So if you're a young man that is working in the construction industry and there is a number of young men, if the immigrant group coming in is principally young men that are working in the construction industry, you might see that group as a threat. Similarly with education and size of household, is this a family thing or is this a something that's associated more so with those individuals, right? What's the nature of the household? What's the nature of the domestic environment when we go home? Macro level variability, we see that gross domestic product is also a big marker of how people trust or don't trust immigrants. If you have higher ability to earn, it might not be as problematic when you have immigrants coming in. That could be a hypothesis you can make. We'll see how it plays out. So you see some results and we look, there's significant spreading out. There's a good, nice sampling here. Most of these countries have similarly sized survey populations. Iceland, probably just too small to get any larger than that. And you see that the highest MIPEX values are observed in the Nordic countries, as well as Portugal, which is not a Nordic country. It is an Atlantic or a South Mediterranean country. It's an Iberian country. The lowest values are found in the post-communist countries of Russia, Lithuania, and Poland. And we've sort of talked about why that might be, particularly with the history of war and the mass genocide. There is a pretty coherent national racial identity in those places. And so mostly you'll see that threat along the nationalist, racialist lines. And so you can look at this and you can see sort of this understanding of perceived threat and different ways that we can sort of analyze these things. And it's an interesting survey. We can look and see the results. I think it very much reflects a lot of the things that we were looking at before, but it just gives an alternative sort of theoretical history. Moving on to this other scoping review from this week, we see a scoping review of literature about mental health and well-being among immigrant communities in the United States. I'm just thinking right now, as I record this, there are a bunch of anti-immigrant policies being implemented throughout the United States under the Trump administration. I mentioned one earlier in the video with a Hmong woman who was arrested on drug charges, go straight to jail, get kicked out of the country. That has not been the norm. There's normally been some due process, and there's a lot of extrajudicial deportations taking place right now. So this scoping review, if you're not familiar with this term, scoping review asks to look at a specific set of literature and then creates sort of blocks or narrative threads that can be observed and offers a critical response to this. So when you see the term scoping review, these are great. They often encapsulate sometimes hundreds, sometimes thousands of research articles, and it's a big literature review, but more so since it's taking such a large sample size of the field of study, the given field of study. So for example, this one's healthcare, mental health care among migrants. What is the broader field of the scholarly interest look like? So just reading this, immigration, both the experience of migrating and the events after migration, can affect the mental health and well-being of immigrants and their communities. However, evidence suggests that immigrants in the United States do not access mental health services to the same extent as non-immigrants. In particular, migrant adolescents and young adults may have unique stressors related to their developmental stage experiences in school and with peers and shifting roles within family systems. This scoping review summarizes findings from published research, studies and practitioner-focused gray literature. So this is like blog posts and government documents and policy papers about the mental health needs of immigrant communities in the United States. The review finds that specific mental health needs vary across factors like age, racial ethnic group, immigration status, and place of residency. Findings also indicate that structural factors like immigration related laws affect both access to mental health services and stressors in the overall environment for immigrants and their families. This review also explores, a lot of alsos in there, try to reduce that sort of repetitive grammatical structure, just a little thing to consider when going into the paper. Findings also, this review also explores models of community level initiatives that utilize strength-based approaches to promoting mental health and well-being among immigrant communities. Findings highlight the need for a better understanding of the mental health needs and current barriers to care among diverse immigrant populations. As immigration continues to play a major role in U.S. public policy and discourse, the COVID-19 pandemic takes place as this article goes to press in 2020, also raises questions regarding health equity and access for marginalized populations, including immigrants and their communities, and so these findings also indicate the need for further interdisciplinary research to assess intersections among the pandemic's many impacts, including those related to mental health and well-being. There was a time, and we are quickly leaving this time, where every single research article had to have COVID-19 in it. I am not completely sold that this article really put a nice little bow on it, but most likely this was the product of trying to get it published in this paper. This is in this journal, Health Promotion Practice. If I can get something about COVID in there, I'm going to get it published. Key terms that we see health disparities, qualitative research, health research, international cross-cultural health, minority health, social determinants of health. If you want to go get a degree in sociology and anthropology and you don't necessarily want to go work in like criminal justice or the private sector, there is a great deal of need for cross-cultural health translators. Spirit catches you and you fall down is a very excellent example of that. We're going to see countless other examples of how these international and cross-cultural health representatives can work. So we see here in the initial part of it, we see the definition of what's an immigrant, what's the different categories of immigration, and then here in the scoping review, so that first part's really good, just to see like, okay, how can we categorize different groups of immigrants and how may their mental health be affected? We think about the Hmong community in the United States. We're going to see a very specific set of mental health issues, particularly the frequency of suicide and also the post-traumatic stress that is associated with being both a refugee community and also a community that fought generations worth of wars. So research question 1, as we're looking at all of these various different articles about the mental health of immigrants, we're going to have just some basic questions to help us organize right off the bat. We're going to survey all these articles. What does existing literature tell us about immigration and health equity in the United States? Very basic categorical question. And then what does existing literature tell us about the role of immigration status as a social determinant of health to the United States? So we have first this question about what are the different categories of literature. Second, then we have this question specifically about the mental health determinants of immigrant communities in the United States. The results, we see disparities in mental health services use among immigration populations in the United States. There are several different things that we can assume. Most scholars argue that immigration itself can be considered a social determinant of health. Okay, so immigration, you see right off the bat, is very frequently talked about in terms of mental health and health indices. You have a nice little breakdown here. Sometimes you see You see here, let me just see this if I can. We can't rotate on the screen. It says select scope and review findings, quantitative and qualitative studies with implications for the mental health and well-being of immigrant populations in the United States. So we see some national scope looking. We see that there are people. This is going to be looking at national level surveys. So there's 372 pieces of literature out there, thoroughly academically constructed, 372 that look at the role of mental health at a national level. We see then there is a specific focus in the United States in this particular article, and 15, sorry, I had to look close on my monitor there. 15 look at the northeastern region, so like New England and New York. There are a large amount, 197, that look at a online survey of specific regions. Then we can also have another, okay, so this is, we see a quantitative, so those were quantitative reviews. We see another quantitative review that's looking at another national level, and we see others. And we see some greater explanations here about the different types of surveys that get constructed. All right, so we look there. These are the overarching N numbers. N typically looks at the sample size. That N is, what's your N? You'll have people say that or ask that, and you'll have here, you see that in these surveys, these specific national or regional level surveys that are being surveyed and scoped, that there's various different levels. Sometimes it's just 3, and this is still a quantitative review with 32, and then you can see a quantitative review with 1200 here on the screen. So we have all these different reviews, very interesting, many surveys. How can we organize all these surveys? Mental health considerations for adolescents and young adults. This is right there. Thinking about the family issues. There's a lot of work in the book about how the first generation Americans that could speak English would often have to translate for their elders. And just think about having to translate all these traumas and these healthcare stories and negotiate the problems of racism and ethnocentrism alongside what is most likely going to be some form of economic or social precarity on top of it. You might get deported. Your workers' rights, even if you have a green card and a work visa, you are not going to necessarily have as much security as a native-born citizen just because that's how the law practices it. So we see here some issues, and then we have the survey of strength-based approaches. So this would be empowering discourse, looking like talking about well-being and promoting a positive lifestyle. And we see the survey of the different studies that have analyzed what it means to support positive life practices. And then we have the discussion here as well as a conclusion, which more or less says what more work needs to be done. So as we are looking at all of these resources, you are going to have a great deal of material to sort through and cite in your essays. Please keep me posted if you have any questions. I would be happy to look at any outlines or thesis or introductory paragraphs, and I look forward to seeing your essays.